So it is a great pleasure to have you here once again. We all know who you are, and it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to listen to your presentation. And so let's please welcome Professor Elster once again.
Is it on? Yes, obviously. Okay. Should I?
Can you start again?
I have to start again from the very beginning. Okay. But first, I need to make sure. What is the optimal distance of the mic from the mouth?
Like that.
Like that? Okay. The louder the better. I'm not sure we really mean that. Oh. Anyway, so I start from the beginning, and by thanking Claudio again for having me here, and being glad to be back. As I said, some familiar faces in the audience. When I was here, I think in 2009, I gave several talks, one of them on excessive ambitions in the social sciences, that is, excessive explanatory ambitions. Later I published another paper, which I think Claudio has asked you to read as background, Excessive Ambitions Part 2, which is about excessive ambitions in normative political philosophy. And today's talk will partly be about that. Negative criticism of existing theories of institutional design, normative theories of institutional design, but also partly, and perhaps more interestingly, positive and constructive. So the constructive part is inspired by works by Jeremy Bentham. Not Bentham's utilitarianism, which I'm going to criticize, but by Bentham's book Political Tactics and other writings on institutional design. So, so this is the paper that's been circulated, and I also suggested to Claudio that students could read chapter 4 of my book, Securities Against Misrule, came out last year, where I discuss some of these issues. So here's an overview of the talk. First, I'm going to sketch a very commonly made positive theory of how to design institutions and explain why it fails. And then I'm going to discuss another positive theory and explain why that fails. And then I'm going to come to the key part of the talk, Bentham's theory, which I'm going to call the theory of negation of the negation. It sounds like Hegel, but it's not. It's a theory of obstacles to institutional designs. The task of the institutional designer is to create obstacles to good decision making. So that is a take-home line for this talk. Create obstacles to good decision making. That's the take-home line. Then I'm going to enumerate, discuss these obstacles to good decision making, and then I'm going to enumerate some of the many obstacles to obstacles one might create, because this is an indefinitely long list of obstacles to obstacles. Depends on human ingenuity to create obstacles to these obstacles. And then I'm going to have various qualifying remarks, additional remarks towards the end. And I may cut some of this. Claudio, we should aim at having at least 20 minutes, preferably half an hour for discussion, right? Sure. Preferably half an hour. Or more. Okay. So let me first explain briefly my frustration with existing theories of institutional design. So these are theories that claim to design institution to promote some conception of justice, let's say distributive justice. So one problem is that there are too many such theories. Rawls, utilitarianism, Scanlon, Nozick, etc. There are too many theories, and there seems to be no possibility of agreement among philosophers about which of these theories to adopt. Second, even if there were such an agreement, the implications of any of these theories for actual institutional design, such as designing juries, electoral systems, parliaments, and so on, are entirely indeterminate. They don't tell us what to do. So it's this double problem of identifying the correct theory of distributive justice and then of drawing implications from any such theory for actual institutional design that has made me very frustrated. Now, just a personal aside. For many years at Columbia University, I taught a year-long sequence on justice with my friend and colleague Brian Barry, also Claudio's teacher. Brian used to teach the fall semester on theories of distributive justice. I used to teach the spring semester on empirical studies of justice. And as I often said in a seminar, and I think Claudio can testify to that, I despaired myself of proposing a theory of distributive justice in the first person singular. My task was mainly to understand how the conceptions of distributive justice held by social actors could explain their behavior. That is, I was talking about justice in the third person singular or the third person plural, not in the first person singular. I did not propose my theory of distributive justice. Now, that's what I'm going to do today. What I did in my book, Security Against Misrule, and what I did in this shorter version that was distributed. Because I decided it was possible to do so by being more modest. So the proposal I'm going to make to you today is, I hope, both more modest and more robust than the sort of grand theories of distributive justice. So, when I talk about institutional design, I'm only going to talk about designing democratic institutions, specifically 3 such institutions: the jury, the electoral system, and the elected assemblies. Some of the remarks I'm going to make can also apply to non-elected institutions, such as constitutional courts or the boards of central banks. But mainly it's an argument about how to design democratic institutions. So that's one limitation, I suppose, of the talk. So there's an obvious, very attractive theory about how to design institutions. They should be designed so as to best realize the general will, the public interest, or something similar. Now, I think this obvious candidate fails on 2 grounds. First, as I shall argue at some length, the notion of the general interest, or the public good, or the general will, whatever, is indeterminate, multiply indeterminate. Second, even if it were not, the choice of means to realize this public interest or general good is entirely or largely indeterminate. So it's a double indeterminacy of ends and of means. In my first article on excessive ambitions, I argued for the indeterminacy of means, that is, our poorly developed causal theories about ends-means relations. That's going to be in the background of my talk today, where I'm going to focus on the indeterminacy of ends. So here's a just brief preview of what I'm going to argue. Cardinal utilitarianism, the kind of utilitarianism that Bentham proposed, is indeterminate. Even if it were determinate, it would be normatively unattractive. Pareto comparison, in terms of ordinal utilitarianism, is usually also indeterminate. Preference aggregation by majority voting can be indeterminate, the so-called Condorcet paradox. And belief aggregation by majority voting can also be indeterminate. That's something I'm going to call the Poisson paradox after its discoverer, although today it's most commonly known by the heading of the doctrinal paradox or the discursive dilemma. So these are the 5 reasons I shall propose, the 5 arguments I shall propose for my claim that the notion of the public good, the general will, etc., is indeterminate. So let me start with the first of these, cardinal utilitarianism. We know how to aggregate different people's wealth. It's easy. We can compare how the wealth, the money in the bank of different individuals. One has more than another. We can add up their respective riches and talk about the total amount of wealth in society. Bentham thought naively that one could do the same thing for utility, that we could sort of measure the amount of utility, happiness, welfare of each person, like some kind of psychic stuff. Like money is physical stuff, utility will be psychic stuff, and we could compare the amount of this psychic stuff possessed by different people, and add up the total amount of psychic stuff of all individuals, and say that in one society there's more total stuff, psychic stuff, in total than in another society, and so on. Now, this sounds attractive, and we sort of do it very often. For instance, in income redistribution, we assume that poor people get more utility out of a dollar than rich people. But there's no operational procedure in general for comparing the levels of utility of different individuals. So the whole notion of maximizing total welfare in society is, generally speaking, indeterminate. Not necessarily meaningless, but operationally indeterminate. Nobody knows how to do it. Now, even if it were feasible to do it, it would be normatively unattractive for these 4 distinct reasons. So the theory of utility maximization takes no account of distributive concerns. So for instance, in a 2-person society, distribution that gave 100 utiles, unit of utility, to one person and 1 unit to another, would be preferred to one that gave 50 utiles to each, which seems counterintuitive or absurd. Second, the theory takes no account of the sources of utility. It would count utility derived from statistics actions on a par with utility derived from consumption, which also seems counterintuitive. Third, it takes no account of individual rights. So suppose you could maximize total utility by killing people at random in the street and using their organs to save the lives of, for each person, 7 different individuals, taking both kidneys, the heart, the lungs, and so on. That would maximize, let's suppose, total utility, but obviously is absurd. And finally, like almost all theories of the public interest, utilitarianism has no way of taking into account the welfare of future generations. We don't know how many people there will be in each future generation, nor, unfortunately, how many future generations there will be. So, because both economists and political theorists recognize these difficulties with utilitarianism, they have proposed a less ambitious way of measuring or comparing social states in terms not of the satisfaction of cardinal utilities, like psychic stuff, but in terms of satisfaction of ordinary utilities, which is just another way of saying satisfaction of preferences. So economists will recommend a move from one state to another, if the move makes some people better off and nobody worse off. Now that's a very limited aim. And there are some moves that have this property. For instance, to take a simple example, a society with a functioning legal system is better for everybody because it enables people to make credible promises and engage in trade and long-term commitments. But most political policy decisions are not of this kind. Most policy decisions have losers as well as winners, and then the Pareto criterion doesn't help us. Now I come to, well, maybe I should go quickly here, just to leave time for discussion. The Condorcet paradox is a paradox of cycling majorities. It's possible, and it happens from time to time, although people dispute how often it happens, that there can be a majority preferring A over B, another majority preferring B over C, and a further majority preferring C over A. That is, cycling, rotating majority preferences. In that case, we could say that the society doesn't know what it wants. Similarly, there are cases in which society doesn't know what it believes. Here I should probably put up a slide, because it's a less well-known idea. No, you cannot see that. Okay, I'll explain it. So, the belief of the majority can be indeterminate. Suppose you have 3 judges, 1, 2, and 3, and there's a legal case, and there are 2 issues that arise. Did the accused do X, and is doing X breaking the law? That is, matter of fact and matter of the law. And one can construct cases, and if you can read it, that's what I've done, in which one could reach a conclusion by 2 different paths. First, the judges could vote on the factual premise and on the legal premise, and draw the implication from those 2 votes. So in this case, there's a majority saying that he did it, a majority saying that it was breaking the law. So the majority implied by these 2 votes should be that he was guilty. On the other hand, the judges could vote directly on the conclusion. Did he do it? And then you see that 2 of the judges would say, no, he wasn't guilty. So therefore he should be acquitted. So there are 2 ways of aggregating beliefs, often called premise aggregation and conclusion aggregation. And they give, as in this example, an opposite results. And there's no general reason I've come across to make us prefer one procedure over the other. So I'm not saying that this is always the case, but there are studies of the US Supreme Court suggesting that it's quite often the case on that court that there is indeterminacy in the sense that belief aggregation, premise aggregation, and conclusion aggregation would have given different results. So now I'm mostly finished with the negative part of the talk, but there's one more part. Suppose you accept my argument that we cannot design institutions to promote the general interest, the public interest, or whatever. You might nevertheless think that institutions could be designed to select good decision makers. Here I need to digress a little bit. What do I mean by a good decision maker? What are the qualities one should ask for in decision makers? And here I rely on the pioneering work of Bentham, and I'm going to add a wrinkle of my own. Bentham said, in my language, that decision makers should have ability, competence, virtue, good morals, impartiality, and energy. He also added, and this is very important, that these properties interact multiplicatively, not additively. So the worst thing you could ask for would be to have someone who was very able, very energetic, but had very bad morals. And Bentham cites Napoleon as an example in this category, and I think Stalin and Hitler might also fit that description. Now, after I published the book, it occurred to me that there's one more thing that we would like good decision makers to have, and that is a low rate of time discounting, or foresight. I don't think that quality reduces to any of the other three, so I think it's an additional fourth element that comes on top of the three requirements that Bentham identified. So, 4 properties that we would want them to have. To repeat, ability, virtue, energy, and foresight. Then, the theories I'm going to discuss now are based on the premise that one can select reliably decision makers on the basis decision makers that possess these properties. Now, mostly these are not directly observable, so we have to use proxies that can be expected to be highly correlated with these unobservable properties. So throughout history, people have used property ownership, especially landed property, tax payment, income, sometimes literacy, sometimes residence in the case of selecting deputies, and other criteria, in the hope that these could be reliable proxies for the unobservable properties that I mentioned. I think it's fair to say that all these attempts have failed. Nobody believes that property is a proxy for wisdom. And if it is a proxy for ability, which is often not the case, that doesn't help us, because, as I said, these attributes interact multiplicatively, not additively. So what we really would need is a system that would select for people with all these desirable properties, and no such system exists or will ever exist. So today nobody believes in disfranchising anyone except for the categories identified by Claudio. So what about the positive? So this is what Bentham says. In this branch of government, as in many others, the end is, so to speak, of a negative character. The object is to avoid inconveniences, to prevent the difficulties which must result from a large assembly of men being called to deliberate in common. The art of legislature is limited to the prevention of everything which might prevent the development of their liberty and their intelligence. So a double negation, as I said, prevent the prevention of intelligence, or more generally, creates obstacles with obstacles to ability, virtue, and energy, and now I would add foresight. So this is the Benthamite program. So what are the obstacles to good decision making? In my book, I say, Bentham said it's self-interest, or what he called sinister interest, essentially corruption. In my book, I add irrationality to the obstacles, namely passions, episodic passions, prejudices, standing prejudices, and cognitive biases. And based on what I just said, I will also now add a higher rate of time discounting among the obstacles to good decision making. Now, the question is, are these sources of influence on decision makers, sinister interest, passion, prejudice, bias, high rate of time discounting, always negative? No, I don't think so. Kant said, in particular about passion, nothing great is ever done without passion. And I think he was right. If you look at the history of revolutions and constitution making, which I've been doing, you see that passion was often an indispensable part of the process that managed to break down old regimes. However, you cannot design institutions on the basis of favoring passions in the institution. Surely, we don't want jurors to make their decisions on the basis of anger or fear, or assembly members to make their decisions on the basis of fear or vanity or whatever it might be. So I think in institutional design, passion is to be rigorously avoided, which is not to say that passion may not be indispensable in the grander scheme of things when moving from one form of society to another. So these were the obstacles, 4 or 5 obstacles. So here are some obstacles to the obstacles. Bentham emphasized almost exclusively judicious choice of either publicity and secrecy. Publicity in assemblies, secrecy in general elections, and in jury deliberations. Other tools or obstacles to the obstacles are anonymity, so that nobody should know the identity of the decision makers. The creation of an artificial veil of ignorance, so that the decision makers should not know, behind the veil of ignorance, exactly how their decisions might affect their personal interests. Ensuring that that decision makers have what is now often called skin in the game, that is, are affected personally by their own decisions. So that deputies cannot simply tax others and exempt themselves. This was a major issue, I think, in the independence of America in the 18th century. It turned out to be impossible to create a system where the British, in taxing the Americans, would at the same time be taxing themselves. Randomization is very frequently used, and similar mechanical procedures to remove interest or suspicion of interest from decision makers, rotation of decision makers, I'll talk about that a bit later, and delay procedures, which can have several functions, which I'll also get back to. Now, I want to insist on the idea that this list is an open list, and it really is up to the ingenuity of the institutional designer to find such tools, to create obstacles to these obstacles that I mentioned. So now I'm going to spend some time going through examples. So this is, you cannot read this, but or probably not. But I'm going to comment on them. So in trials, publicity is essential to prevent judges and prosecutors from abusing their powers, whereas the deliberations of the jurors, by contrast, should be kept in secret. So jury trials are a good example of how the combination of publicity and secrecy can generate can be obstacles to interest and passions by protecting jurors from threats and bribes. Now, another feature of jury trials is that jurors are always kept ignorant about certain facts of the case or certain aspects of the law that might bias their decision. So judges take it upon themselves to create an artificial veil of ignorance to prevent the jurors from being influenced by irrelevant facts, such as a previous conviction of the accused person. A further example of an artificial veil of ignorance is a proposal that was pending in the US Congress some years ago, I don't know what happened to it, that all representatives and senators should be obliged to put their financial assets in a blind trust, so that they would be unable to tell how what they did as legislators affected their interests as private persons. It would seem to be an obvious proposal, but as it would have to be adopted by Congress, you might perhaps see why there might be some opposition to it. Then An issue that comes up in very many contexts is the length of tenure of elected and appointed officials. And on this particular point, there's also some indeterminacy. So I'm not going to claim that the Benthamite approach always yields determinate results. Sometimes the Benthamite approach itself can be indeterminate. And let me just illustrate here briefly how the length of tenure could have ambiguous consequences. So, short length of tenure for appointed and elected officials has always been justified by the need to prevent capture of officials by interest groups. Long tenure has been justified on two grounds. First, it enables officials to learn. If they are rotated too often, they will never learn what they need to know to do the job. And second, if officials have a relatively long tenure, they can engage in long-term planning rather than just for 6 months or a year. A very good book that I recommend to you by Anthony King and Ivor Crew, called The Blunders of Our Governments, shows in detail how the high turnover rate of ministers in the British government in recent decades prevented them from engaging in long-term planning. So not only does the normal electoral cycle limit the scope for long-term planning, but even the rapid turnover of ministers within that cycle further truncates the time horizon of the agents. But so these two considerations work in opposite directions, and it's hard to imagine how we would define the optimal trade-off between the opposite considerations, because that would require a theory of social causality that I don't think we have. So very often institutional designers think in terms of trade-offs. They argue, as I just said, that on the one hand, short tenure has problems, on the other hand, long tenure has problems. So the question is to determine optimal length of tenure. Well, that question presupposes that we have a robust social theory of social causality, which I argued in Accession Ambitions Part 1, presented here 5 years ago, that we don't have. So I'm not saying that Bentham solves all problems. And let me just give quickly another example of the same indeterminacy. Publicity has the very desirable effect in assemblies of making it difficult for deputies to act according to their naked self-interest, because they will be held accountable by the public if they do so. At the same time, publicity can generate strong passions, and the passions can distort the deliberative and decision-making process. So, for instance, it has often been said, and it was probably true, that if the Federal Convention of 1787 had not been held behind closed doors, the convention would not have been able to reach a conclusion, because the passions would have been too strong. So, secrecy and publicity also can be indeterminate, and in this case it's hard to think of an optimal compromise between secrecy and publicity, although one might perhaps think of something. By contrast, there are some mechanisms that are more robust. So, for instance, both the Chinese and the Roman empires had something like the law of avoidance that prevented officials from serving in their native province for obvious reasons, and that was probably a good thing and had good consequences without any offsetting bad consequences. Now, one problem that plagues many contemporary democracies is that elected officials lack energy. That is, they don't devote enough time to their task because they are too busy either occupying other offices, as in France, or getting re-elected, as in the United States. I cannot say anything about Mexico in this respect. So in France, officials are allowed by what is called the cumul des mandats, the accumulation of offices, to hold up to 5 elected offices mayor, regional councillor, and so on, national deputy, and deputy to the European Parliament. And it's clear and acknowledged by everybody that this has a negative effect on the energy of the deputies because they spend too little time doing working for the nation, and too much time working for subnational or supranational entities. But as the community might have to be abolished by Parliament, and as Parliament might want to keep that privilege, it's not clear that it will be abolished. In the United States, it's different. There it is, the obstacle to energy is the amount of time, roughly 50% of their time, that elected representatives and senators spend seeking money for re-election. Now, this is, in the first place, a massive social waste, because when everybody's doing so, nobody can really expect to gain very much from doing it. But also, it impinges either on the representatives' energy or on their virtue. So let me explain. Suppose you put a ceiling on aggregate campaign contributions from private sources. That would reduce the time that the deputies spend seeking money, and therefore improve their energy, that is the time they spend on their task, their elective task. On the other hand, it would risk making the deputies beholden to certain large donors, and therefore subvert their virtue, their morals. On the other hand, you could create a cap on individual campaign contributions. That would not be a threat to their virtue of the deputies, because they wouldn't be highly beholden to any particular person, but it would create a problem for their energy, because they would have to spend a lot of time gathering many small contributions. The obvious solution is to have campaigns funded by the state, but that seems to be unthinkable in some countries. So I have spent a lot of my time, my work on the constitution-making process. And two conclusions from that work are relevant for the present purposes. First, one should separate constitution makers from soldiers and crowds. That's a simple, commonsensical recommendation, because if soldiers or crowds can influence the work of the framers, passion, fear might dominate rational deliberation. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes passion is needed to overcome vested interests. But what I think one can say more robustly is that in constitution making is desirable to separate the constituent power and the legislative power. That is, the Constituent Assembly should not at the same time be an ordinary legislature, because if it is, there will be a tendency for that assembly to write excessively large powers for the legislature into the Constitution, because they will be following either personal interest or institutional interest. So, I'm not going to make a more radical proposal, although less radical, I think, in Latin America than in Europe. And that is a proposal to encourage the energy of voters, that is, to fight abstentionism. How can you make voters increase the turnout of the voters? Well, of course, you can make voting mandatory, but there's another way, which is sort of in Bentham spirit. You could publish the names of non-voters in newspapers or on the internet. And my former student and friend and Claudia's friend Julia Masquivker tells me that in Argentina, not only is voting mandatory, but the names of non-voters are posted on the internet. So that would be harnessing social norms for the public good, as it were. I mentioned this proposal to my good friend Klaus Offe, the German sociologist, and he was horrified by it. He wouldn't want anyone to know whether he voted or not. But note that anonymity and secrecy are not the same thing. You can protect the secrecy of the vote. Nobody should know how you voted. But I cannot see any strong reason for protecting people from knowing whether, preventing people from knowing whether you voted. So that is, I think, in Bentham's spirit, although he did not propose it. So let me mention a couple of uses of delays. Delays can have several functions. Delays can enable time for passions to cool down, and delays can create, to some extent, an artificial veil of ignorance. So I think there's a good reason why many countries have a ban on sale of liquor on election day. You don't want voters to be drunk. And also I think one reason why in some countries there's a delay, a mandatory delay of 1 week perhaps, between the last televised political debates and the actual voting, so that people should not just agree with the last speaker, but have time to work out their own opinions. Delays can also, as I said, be useful in creating an artificial veil of ignorance. An example I shall give is from changing the electoral law. It is known from many countries that changes in electoral law and in districting, redistricting, is often done for purely tactical, short-term political purposes, not on any principal grounds. Well, one can write into the Constitution the following clause. Assuming that the length of the normal electoral cycles is n years, any change in electoral law, when after being adopted, should not take effect until after n plus 1 years. So nobody could count on the electoral law that they adopted being in force in the first national elections. That could be one way of diluting, at least, interest, because the more distant the future, the less certain can the parties be about where their electoral interests will lie. Okay, I have some more examples which I'll skip, because I want to make a few more comments. First, about secrecy and publicity. I'll just mention one proposal by Bentham, which I think is extremely valuable, and I think should be adopted in pretty much all decisions are made by voting in committees and assemblies, not in elections, but in committees and assemblies. That is a combination of ex ante secrecy and ex post publicity of voting. So at the time of voting, nobody would know in a committee or in the parliament how others are voting. After the vote, everybody would know how everybody voted. The first feature, ex ante secrecy, would reduce, not eliminate, but reduce conformism and peer pressure. And the second feature would increase accountability, because people would be asked, how come? How come you voted that way when you didn't argue for it in the debates? So I think that would be a very good reform that should be adopted everywhere. At least I cannot see any arguments against it. Oops. I don't think it's a problem. I hope not. Water is water. I sometimes do this with coffee. That's more of a problem. Now, I want to add a few things and qualify a few things in what I've been saying so far before I conclude. I've been assuming that the way to shape decision makers or to shield decision makers is always by acting on individuals. But what about groups? Couldn't there be group properties that are intrinsically desirable? And in the literature, there are two candidates for such group properties: size and diversity. That is, people have argued that large groups are better, other things being equal perhaps, at making decisions than small groups, and that diverse groups are better than more homogeneous groups. The first claim is also referred to as Condorcet's jury theorem. Condorcet proved the mathematical fact that if you have a jury or any political body voting by majority voting, if all the members are minimally competent in the sense that they are at least 50% likely to arrive at the truth, if they form their opinions independently of each other, and if they vote sincerely, then as the number of voters increases, the probability of the majority getting it right increases towards 100%. This is a mathematical truth that nobody can object to. I don't think in practice one could ever verify that the conditions, assumptions are satisfied. How do we know that all the members are minimally competent? How do we know that they form their opinions independent of each other? How do we know that they vote sincerely, non-strategically? Well, the answer is we don't. So I think it's a beautiful theorem with no practical use in politics. Moreover, Bentham argued very persuasively that as assemblies expand in size, each member loses the incentive to inform himself or herself because of what is now called the informational free riding problem. So it's even worse than what I just said. Now, diversity is a more interesting issue, and there I do believe in the value of diversity or information pooling, you might say, by people from diverse backgrounds with diverse experiences. Many of you will have seen the movie 12 Angry Men, where the dynamic of the process is driven by the fact that the jury members have very different experiences, and so are able to pick holes on the basis of their personal experience in the evidence presented by the prosecution. And I think in constituent assemblies, this need for diversity is especially important, as I argue at some length in the book, and I don't think I'll take the time to do so now. Well, maybe I should briefly summarize what I claim in that book, because much of that book, in much of that chapter in that book, chapter 4, I compare the French and American assemblies of 1789 and 1787. And I compare two values of diversity. Diversity might be able to make an assembly better at identifying where the shoe pinches. That is, what the problems are. And it might make it better able to improve its ability to make good shoes. That is, to solve the problems. And I think the American framers were very bad at finding out where the shoe pinched, because assembly was very non-representative of the 13 states. But they were very good on the basis of their experience in the 13 states of finding good political solutions. In France, this was the other way around. The deputies to the States General and National Assembly were selected deliberately for their diversity. So they knew very well the problems of France in 1789. However, they had zero political experience. So all their solutions were based on a priori thinking and were mostly disastrous. I think the last well, I make two more comments. First is that in the spirit of John Rawls, I've been proposing a theory of institutional design as based on impure procedural justice. Imperfect procedural justice. That is, first we design the institutions as well as we can, and then we have to let the chips fall where they may. There is no independently, we're not assuming that the institution will track some independently defined normative criteria, as Rawls argued was the case for the jury system. We are simply doing our best to screen decision makers from undesirable influences and then let the chips fall where they may. Now, I think in some cases we need an override. In some cases, decisions of juries and of assemblies need an override. In the case of juries, I think judges should be allowed to override what they think are unjustified verdicts of guilty, but not unjustified verdicts of innocence. And this is in fact the case in many countries. In the case of assemblies, I think there should be a constitutional court with the task and only the task of verifying whether the assembly follows the procedural rules laid down in the Constitution, for instance, by preventing itself from voting itself into existence indefinitely. So their overrides may be necessary. And finally, something that goes back to what I said earlier about passion. Even if you assume, even if you accept what I've been saying about institutional design, how could it ever happen? Why would politicians be motivated to bring them into existence? That really requires political will or passion. And passion cannot be engineered, it cannot be predicted, it cannot be manipulated, so it's not an object of institutional design. But it is needed. Thank you. So let me first explain briefly my frustration with existing theories of institutional design. So these are theories that claim to design institution to promote some conception of justice, let's say distributive justice. So one problem is that there are too many such theories. Rawls, utilitarianism, Scanlon, Nozick, etc. There are too many theories, and there seems to be no possibility of agreement among philosophers about which of these theories to adopt. Second, even if there were such an agreement, the implications of any of these theories for actual institutional design, such as designing juries, electoral systems, parliaments, and so on, are entirely indeterminate. They don't tell us what to do. So it's this double problem of identifying the correct theory of distributive justice and then of drawing implications from any such theory for actual institutional design that has made me very frustrated. Now, just a personal aside. For many years at Columbia University, I taught a year-long sequence on justice with my friend and colleague Brian Berry, also Claudio's teacher. Brian used to teach the fall semester on theories of distributive justice.
So it is a great pleasure to have you here once again. We all know who you are, and it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to listen to your presentation. And so let's please welcome Professor Elster once again.
Is it on? Yes, obviously. Okay. Should I?
Can you start again?
I have to start again from the very beginning. Okay. But first, I need to make sure. What is the optimal distance of the mic from the mouth?
Like that.
Like that? Okay. The louder the better. I'm not sure we really mean that. Oh. Anyway, so I'll start from the beginning, and by thanking Claudio again for having me here, and being glad to be back. I used to teach the spring semester on empirical studies of justice. And as I often said in a seminar, and I think Claudio can testify to that, I despaired myself of proposing a theory of distributive justice in the first person singular. My task was mainly to understand how the conceptions of distributive justice held by social actors could explain their behavior. That is, I was talking about justice in the third person singular or the third person plural, not in the first person singular. I did not propose my theory of distributive justice. Now, that's what I'm going to do today. What I did in my book, Security Against Misrule, and what I did in this shorter version that was distributed. Because I decided it was possible to do so by being more modest. So the proposal I'm going to make to you today is, I hope, both more modest and more robust than the sort of grand theories of distributive justice. So, when I talk about institutional design, I'm only going to talk about designing democratic institutions, specifically 3 such institutions: the jury, the electoral system, and the elected assemblies. Some of the remarks I'm going to make can also apply to non-elected institutions, such as constitutional courts, or, as I said, some familiar faces in the audience. When I was here, I think in 2009, I gave several talks, one of them on excessive ambitions in the social sciences, that is, excessive explanatory ambitions. Later I published another paper, which I think Claudio has asked you to read as background, Excessive Ambitions Part 2, which is about excessive ambitions in normative political philosophy. And today's talk will partly be about that, negative criticism of existing theories of institutional design, normative theories of institutional design, but also partly, and perhaps more interestingly, positive and constructive. So the constructive part is inspired by works by Jeremy Bentham. Not Bentham's utilitarianism, which I'm going to criticize, but by Bentham's book Political Tactics and other writings on institutional design. So, so this is the paper that's been circulated, and I also suggested to Claudio that students could read chapter 4 of my book, Securities Against Misrule, came out last year, where I discuss some of these issues. So here's an overview of the talk. First, I'm going to sketch a very commonly made positive theory of how to design institutions and explain why it fails. And then I'm going to discuss another positive theory and explain why that fails. And then I'm going to come to the key part of the talk, Bentham's theory, which I'm going to call the theory of negation of the negation. It sounds like Hegel, but it's not. It's a theory of obstacles to institutional designs. the task of the institutional designer is to create obstacles to good decision making. So that is the take-home line for this talk. Create obstacles to good decision making. That's the take-home line. Then I'm going to enumerate, discuss these obstacles to good decision making. And then I'm going to enumerate some of the many obstacles to obstacles one might create, because this is an indefinitely long list of obstacles to obstacles. Depends on human ingenuity to create obstacles to these obstacles. And then I'm going to have various qualifying remarks, additional remarks towards the end. And I may cut some of this. So we should aim at having at least 20 minutes, preferably half an hour for discussion, right? Sure. Preferably half an hour. Or more.